Welcome to the debrief for the Red Hook Brewing case. And hopefully you've had a chance to read the case carefully, and hopefully you've had a chance to think carefully about the questions we asked you to consider. And also I hope that you've had a chance to discuss some of your insights or thoughts about the case, either online or directly with others in person. So my intent here is not to give answers or tell you what the key takeaways are from the case, but it's more about giving you some things to think about. So there aren't always right or wrong answers per se in a case like this. Just like in real life, there isn't always a perfect strategy for every firm and their situation. But some strategies are better than others. So I think, my purpose here is to give you some things to think about that might have been interesting as you've contemplated the case after reading it and thinking it over and talking about it with others. So what I want to do is highlight some interesting things that may give you some guidance on how to employ the tools and the frameworks. And the larger goal here is to really help refine your ability to conduct a strategic analysis and use those tools and frameworks in any case you might encounter, not necessarily just the Red Hook case. So let me start by noting something, and this is a fun fact about me, I guess you might say. I don't drink beer. And so you might think, well, why is he telling us that? I'm telling you that for a specific reason. Oftentimes I think we think that when we think about analyzing a company and their strategy and their prospects in the industry, I think that we tend to think if we have direct experience with that particular product or service or industry, that might really improve our intuitions about doing a strategic analysis. And sometimes that can be true, but oftentimes that's actually not the case. In fact, sometimes we bring our biases with us. If we really have an affinity for a particular product or service or a company, or we have a lot of experience in an industry, we might bring that bias with us, and that might impact the way we think about the strategic questions that we're considering. And the point here is that having direct experience isn't necessarily that important, and in fact sometimes it can work against you. So for example, let's say we were discussing a case about video game console manufacturers in that particular industry. I think oftentimes I've had students in the past in a case like that think, oh, the gamers in the room, the students who do a lot of video gaming are going to have a leg up on everyone else. They're going to have more insights. But oftentimes that's in fact not the case at all. And what I've seen over time is that oftentimes it's the students who don't have direct experience with that particular product or service or industry that can actually come up with some of the best insights. So again, what I want you to focus on here is the point of all this and the tools and the frameworks that we've been talking about is to help you be able to take a step back and be analytical about the questions posed by a particular case as you think about that company or industry. So with that, let's jump right into some of what's interesting in the case. Now, if we're thinking about the tools and the frameworks, we need to think about where are we going to start here. So one of the things we asked you to do is to do a competitor analysis, and that might be a great place to start. But the first thing you have to ask yourself in doing a competitor analysis is, what's the industry? So in this case, in the Red Hook case, that ends up being a key question. Before you can do a competitor analysis, one of the things you might be debating in your mind or even debating with others is, well, what's the right way to think about the industry? Should we think about craft beers? Should we think about all beers? Should we think about all alcoholic drinks? Maybe we should think about all beverages. Do we think about just the US market or the world market? There's a host of questions about just how to scope the industry that I think are really important here. So I just wanted to highlight that as one of the interesting things for you to consider as you get ready to do any of the aspects of your strategic analysis. Starting with a competitor analysis, you need to think carefully about what the industry is. So, as an aside, let's just think about that for a moment. What makes industry identification difficult? What makes it challenging? Again, some of it might be product differentiation. So you could think about the automobile industry. Porsche and Kia are both automobile manufacturers, but in a lot of ways they aren't really competing for the same clients or the same customers, right? They're very different kinds of cars. So that's one challenge. Another challenge might be geographic differentiation. So think of something like cell phone carriers, wireless carriers. I mean, oftentimes that's very geographically compartmentalized, right? So in the US, there are certain carriers that compete with each other. In Europe, there are different carriers that compete with each other, and they're sort of confined to those geographic markets. So that can make it a challenge, right? Another thing that can make it a challenge is thinking about close substitutes. So let's say, again, we're talking about beverages, but not alcoholic ones. Sometimes the difference between soda and Gatorade, I mean, how carefully do we need to think about that? They're clearly substitutes for one another, and if they're real close substitutes, that can make it difficult to identify the industry. So one useful idea might be to think about what I would refer to as strategic groups. And here you're just really trying to think about competitors that are more close competitors, and there's other competitors that might be further or more distant competitors, but we still want to think about them, right? So it may be useful, going back to our competitor analysis, to do a competitor analysis at several different levels. It might be very useful to do a competitor analysis, certainly of the craft brewing market segment, right? Red Hook is directly competing with Boston Beer and Peet's and some of these other craft brewers that they're going head-to-head with. But it also might be useful to think about mass brewers, the Anheuser-Busch's and the Millers of the world. Again, it's a different kind of product, but you know, they can substitute in and out for each other, and that might be something for you to think about, right? So once you've identified these different strategic groupings, you might think of craft brewers, and then you might think of the larger mass brewers. What sorts of things do you want to do in your competitor analysis? Well, obviously, you might want to think about particular metrics, thinking about market share and sales and the types of things that you're really considering based on your reading of the case. But a good competitor analysis isn't just a list of a bunch of numbers by the side of some firms, right? We also want to think about what are the differences in strategy, right? Are there strategic differences within some of these firms? Are there, differences having to do with economies of scale or capacity utilization or the way these firms advertise? So that might differ between the craft brewers and the mass brewers, and it might even differ between competitors in one of those strategic groups. But I want you to think, that's one thing for you to think about as you're doing a competitor analysis. How can you really dig into the competitive differences in the way those firms execute on their strategies? That might be a useful way to think about it. Another tool you might want to use is an environmental analysis. We asked you to do one of those. So again, you could go through the environmental analysis. I won't go through all of that. I think that that's relatively clear on what to do there. But as you think about all of these different aspects of an environmental analysis, thinking about demographic trends or sociocultural trends, I think one of the things that students who work with this case have pointed out to me in the past is that when you do an environmental analysis, it seems kind of clear that it favors craft brewing. You know, when we think of demographic differences, there's more and more disposable income at the time of the case. We're talking about the mid-90s. So there's the rise of kind of the middle class. There's more disposable income. We see sociocultural trends around a greater demand for luxury products and locally sourced products and healthy products. And, you know, that might lend itself better towards this craft brewing segment that uses, local ingredients and things to make it seem more gourmet or upscale. So I think that one insight you might gain is that when you walk away from doing an environmental analysis, if I were to ask you, as we did in some of the discussion questions, if I were to ask you, which market segment do you think is more favorable to be in, mass brewing or craft brewing? What's your answer to that question? I mean, we asked you to think carefully about that. If you do a competitor analysis, if you do an environmental analysis, it might sort of lean towards craft brewing. The trends seem good. The growth prospects of the industry are quite good based on all of those environmental trends, right? But I think there's another key insight here in the case that I hope that you sort of stumbled upon or realized as you went through your strategic analysis, and that is that the growth prospects of an industry are not the only thing to consider, right? So some industries, remember, are better than others, and they have, on average, higher profits than others. So what's a tool that will help us kind of determine the difference between different industry or market segments? And this leads us to the 5 forces analysis. So again, I won't walk you all the way through that, but what are some interesting things to think about? I think that, a takeaway, if you're really careful about going through your 5 forces analysis, and especially if you do it for several different industry groupings, if you do it for mass brewers and you do it for craft brewers, a useful way to go about it might be to think about how those 5 forces compare. And I think that the conclusion you'll come to is that craft brewing is a slightly more difficult industry segment to be in. And that's sort of counterintuitive. It would go against the sort of demographic trends and such that might arise out of an environmental analysis. But the 5 forces, if you're really careful and go through those, you can sort of see where all the action is. The rivalry is higher in craft brewing, for instance, than it is in mass brewing. There's only 3 big players in mass brewing. They're pretty comfortable there. Profits are pretty good, right? Growth is not spectacular, but it's steady, right? A threat of entry, again, would threat of entry be higher in craft brewing than mass? I think so. It's awfully hard to break into mass brewing with the economies of scale and everything that's involved there. Bargaining power of suppliers, it's going to be a lot lower in mass. There's only 3 customers. If you're a hops manufacturer, you're hoping to supply Anheuser-Busch or Miller or Coors, and but whereas if you turn the tables and if we think about craft brewing, you're just one tiny little company, and if we don't supply you, we're happy to supply all of your competitors, right? So again, if you think about those 5 forces, you might find counterintuitively that actually they point to the fact that mass brewing is, by those measures, a more favorable market segment, and craft brewing, in terms of the makeup of the industry and the competitiveness, is tougher, right? So what are the takeaways from all of that? There's other points I hope that you realized as you went through your analysis, but I think one of the things I want you to understand is that it's really important to use all of these tools together. That just doing an environmental analysis, for example, won't tell you everything you need to know about what Red Hook should do or not do. But if we combine the insights from these different tools, we start to see a bigger picture emerge. And in this case, what we see is there's some important insights that emerge from doing a 5 forces. And it helps us sort of see that craft brewing it's an easy market segment to enter, and therefore we see lots of growth. We see lots of firms entering, but we also see a lot of turnover in that industry because competition is tough. So I also hope that you thought a little bit about what the future challenges are for Red Hook, and after you've kind of thought through all of these strategic issues, what do you think the key challenges are that Red Hook is faced with? It's a really interesting case discussion, and I hope you enjoyed it.